They said the king feared no man, but there are things a man can fear that do not breathe, things that haunt the chambers of the mind, that whisper when the candles burn low and the court has gone to sleep. And for King Henry VIII, ruler of England, master of power and pomp, it was not a foreign army, nor a scheming noble that kept him awake. It was something far more intimate, something buried so deep in his past that even his confession could not cleanse it. He sat alone in his chambers at Whitehall one cold February night in 1546, the fire casting a wavering light across his aging face. His body had grown swollen and ulcered. His once broad frame now imprisoned him, rather than empowered him. The physicians whispered of rot, of foul humors that ate him from within. Yet Henry's eyes, sharp and glinting beneath heavy lids, betrayed a fear not of death but of remembrance. The courtiers saw only the tyrant, the king who had defied Rome, who had cast aside wives as if they were so many worn garments. But those who served him closely knew there were nights when the king would wake screaming, clutching at the sheets, calling out a name no one dared to repeat. The story begins not with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, nor with Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed a kingdom's faith, but with something that happened long before the world called him Defender of the Faith. It began in the quiet corridors of Greenwich Palace, when Henry was still a young prince, full of laughter and promise, and England was still unbroken. Henry had been his father's second son, the one not meant for the crown. His elder brother Arthur was the heir, disciplined, dutiful, everything Henry was not. But when Arthur died suddenly in 1502, the court whispered that fate had chosen the younger boy for a greater destiny. Yet among the servants and priests, there were murmurs of something darker, that Arthur's death was not fate at all. The official record said the prince succumbed to a sweating sickness, a mysterious plague that swept through England with sudden fury. But the old nurse who attended both boys told a different story, one she only dared whisper years later, when her hair had turned white and her hands shook with age. She said that on the night Arthur fell ill, the brothers had quarreled violently, that Henry in a fit of youthful rage had struck Arthur and the blow had not been forgotten. The nurse claimed she found the young prince the next morning pacing the floor, muttering prayers, his hands trembling, and a bruise blooming across his knuckles. Of course, no one believed her. Or rather, no one dared to. The boy who had once been destined for the church was now the heir to the English throne, and the Tudors could not afford scandal. The nurse was dismissed, her story buried. But guilt, like blood, has a way of seeping through the finest silk. As king, Henry would speak often of divine will, that God had chosen him, that his actions were sanctified by destiny. But those who saw him in private claimed that at times he doubted that divine favor. In the dim hours before dawn, when the palace was still, he would stare into the flames and ask whether God truly forgave him. Years later, when he married Catherine, Arthur's widow, those doubts grew louder. It was more than political necessity. Henry's marriage to her was a kind of penance. He told himself it was to honor his brother's memory, to right a wrong he had caused. But each night beside her, he felt the weight of that memory pressing upon his chest. Catherine would wake to find him sweating, gasping, his eyes wide as though he saw someone standing over him. The court knew nothing of this. To them, Henry was radiant, the golden monarch, a scholar, a sportsman, a king blessed by God. But behind the mask, his nightmares festered. It was during one of those sleepless nights that the first incident occurred. A servant girl named Alice was sent to tend the king's fire. She was young, perhaps 15, small and quiet, the sort of person no one noticed. When she entered the chamber, she saw the king kneeling before the hearth, his lips moving in silent prayer. He did not hear her. Then, as she approached, he turned suddenly, eyes wide, and shouted a name. "Arthur!" The girl screamed, dropping the tongs. Henry lunged forward, seizing her by the wrist, demanding to know who had spoken to her. She stammered, denying everything, but he did not release her until the guards came. By morning, Alice had vanished from the palace, her name erased from the household rolls. Whispers spread among the servants. Some said the king had killed her himself. Others claimed she had gone mad and fled into the night. Whatever the truth, the incident was not spoken of again. But after that night, Henry's temper grew darker, his cruelty sharper. When his first marriage began to crumble, Many believed it was lust that drove him toward Anne Boleyn. But to those closest to him it seemed less about desire and more about desperation, as though he sought in her something that might silence the voice in his dreams. Anne was clever, ambitious, unafraid. She challenged him, taunted him, made him feel alive again. Yet even with her, the nightmares returned. The courtiers said he had turned against her because she could not give him a son. But there were nights when the king would sit alone in his chapel, muttering to himself, saying that Anne knew too much. There is one account, written in secret by a court clerk who later fled England, that tells of a strange confession Henry made to his confessor shortly before Anne's execution. The clerk claimed the king, his voice shaking, admitted to a sin so deep it damned his bloodline. He said he had seen Arthur in his dreams, standing in judgment. The priest, terrified, recorded the words, but never spoke of them again. The execution of Anne Boleyn marked a turning point. After her death, Henry was not merely feared, he was avoided. Even his most trusted advisors spoke to him with trembling hands. The smell of his leg wound filled the air, and his eyes seemed to hold a madness that no crown could conceal. In 1541, during a thunderstorm that rattled the palace, Henry ordered a secret chamber sealed beneath Whitehall. No record of what lay inside has survived. But one mason, writing in his journal, described carving strange symbols into the stone, marks he had never seen before, at the king's insistence. He said Henry told him, "It must be sealed forever. No light must touch it." When the mason asked why, the king turned to him with a look so hollow it chilled him to the bone. "Because he still watches," Henry said, "and I must keep him there." By then, Henry's body was failing, but his paranoia thrived. He ordered mirrors removed from his chambers, claiming they reflected another face. He forbade certain hymns to be sung, saying they summoned the dead. His confessor, a man named John Redman, died mysteriously soon after a private audience with the king. The palace physician wrote that the confessor was struck with a terror that no mortal ailment could explain. In his final years, the king spoke little, but those who served him said he muttered often in his sleep, fragments of prayers and apologies. On the eve of his death, when the court gathered around his bed, he turned to his attendants and whispered, "Do not let him in." When asked who he meant, the king closed his eyes and said nothing more. What did he mean? Was it guilt, madness, or something more? The answer perhaps lies in what came after. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his tomb was not yet finished. His body was placed in a temporary vault beneath St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Weeks later, when workmen went to move the coffin, they found that the lid had cracked and that some strange dark stain had seeped out, spreading across the stone floor. One man swore that as they lifted the casket, he heard a faint sound, like someone whispering a prayer. The others laughed, saying it was just air escaping from the wood. But that man, according to parish records, never worked again. Perhaps it was all coincidence. Perhaps the nurse's story was a lie, the confessor's notes a fabrication, the mason's symbols mere decoration. And yet, in the archives of the British Library there remains a fragment of parchment, unsigned, its ink faded but legible. It reads only this: "The king feared judgment not from God, but from the blood he shed with his own hand. And in the silence of his last nights, he confessed that England was built upon that sin. May it never be unearthed." When Henry VIII died, England breathed a strange mixture of relief and dread. His body may have been buried, but his presence lingered, heavy as the air before a storm. In the weeks that followed, the corridors of Whitehall were quieter, as though the palace itself feared to speak his name. Those who had served him tried to forget. They burned letters, sealed records, erased conversations from memory. But truth has a peculiar way of surviving, like an ember buried deep in ash, waiting for breath. And for those who dared to look, the ember still glowed. It began with a scholar, a man named Edmund Wriothesley, nephew of the late Chancellor. A precise, cautious man, trained in law and Latin, not given to superstition. In 1550, 3 years after the king's death, he was charged with organizing the royal papers that had been hastily gathered from Whitehall after the funeral. Among the mountains of parchment, tax decrees, marriage contracts, treaties, he found something strange, a letter sealed with black wax, bearing the royal insignia yet unsigned. It was addressed not to a person, but to he who guards the secret beneath. The script was Henry's. The letter itself was brief, but chilling. Let no man disturb the chamber beneath the palace. Let no hand unseal what I have sealed, for within lies the proof of my sin and the curse that binds my house. If this be read, know that I have failed to silence him. The seal had not been broken. Wriothesley, unnerved, showed it to no one, but curiosity, like guilt, is relentless. Days later, he went to Whitehall himself, descending into the old lower corridors where the servants once kept the wine. He found the sealed door, thick oak, iron-banded, marked with carvings almost erased by time. And though the order said no light must touch it, Edmund held up his lantern. The carvings were not decorative at all. They were words, Latin, written in a trembling hand. He could make out only fragments. Frater, ignoce mihi, brother, forgive me. Behind the door came no sound, only the cool breath of stone. He reached out as if to trace the words, and stopped when he heard something else. Not movement, not air, but the faintest echo of his own heartbeat, doubled, like another pulse answering from behind the wall. He fled before dawn. When he returned to his quarters, he burned the letter. But his sleep was never easy again. Years passed. The crown shifted hands. The faith of England swung between Rome and Reform, and the memory of the old king faded into legend. Yet Whitehall kept its shadows. Servants spoke of cold spots, of whispers near the sealed passage. A few even claimed to see a figure in royal robes moving through the corridors at night, limping, heavy, muttering prayers no one could understand. By 1604, the palace had changed. King James now ruled, curious about everything from witchcraft to the divine right of kings. When he heard that one section of Whitehall had been sealed since Henry's time, his curiosity flared. Against his advisors' protests, he ordered it opened. The masons worked 3 days breaking the old stones. The air that escaped was foul, heavy with decay. Behind the door lay not a room but a small vault, circular, lined with brick, no more than 10 feet across. At its center stood a stone sarcophagus. No inscription, no cross, only the royal seal. James, ever the scholar, ordered it unsealed. But when they pried open the lid, the masons drew back in horror. Inside was no body, only a length of crimson cloth wrapped around something small and brittle. The king leaned closer. Within the folds lay a child's bones. No record in any chronicle spoke of such a child. No royal bastard, no stillborn heir. The king turned to his secretary and demanded an explanation, but none could give it. The vault was resealed that same night, and every man present swore an oath of silence. But secrets breed whispers, and whispers become stories. Soon, the rumor spread that Henry VIII had fathered a child, one he had ordered hidden, or worse, destroyed. Some said it was Anne Boleyn's. Others claimed it was Catherine's final child, born in secret and sacrificed in desperation to end his guilt. But one theory, darker still, took hold among those who had read the oldest records. They said the bones were not his child's. They said they were Arthur's. The nurse's tale, once dismissed, was remembered again. Scholars began to piece together fragments. The confessor's lost notes, the mason's symbols, the strange Latin pleas carved into stone. Piece by piece a picture formed, that Henry's guilt had not been metaphorical, that the sin which damned his bloodline was fratricide. If true, it explained much. His obsession with legitimacy, his fear of divine judgment, his violent shifts between affection and fury, all signs of a man haunted by a crime no crown could pardon. Yet even centuries later, proof remained elusive. The vault was sealed again under royal order. Its location lost when Whitehall burned in 1698. The palace was rebuilt, but the old cellars were abandoned, buried beneath new walls and streets. It might have ended there, buried forever, if not for an excavation in 1939. London was preparing for war. Engineers surveying the old grounds for shelter construction stumbled upon a section of ancient foundation. Beneath layers of soot and brick, they found the remains of a sealed archway. On one stone, faint but legible, were the words, Frater, ignoce mihi. When the engineers broke through, they discovered the remnants of a chamber, half collapsed, waterlogged, and reeking of mold. Most of the contents were destroyed. But near the far wall, preserved by centuries of still air, lay a single object, a decayed leather pouch, sealed with wax. Inside, wrapped in parchment, was a note, its ink almost gone. It read, "He made me swear to keep it below, to let no priest near. He said it cries in the dark, God forgive him, and God forgive me." There was no signature, but tucked beneath the note was a ring, gold engraved with the Tudor rose. The discovery never reached the public. The war began soon after, and the records were quietly absorbed into the Ministry of Works. The pouch vanished in 1940 during a bombing raid. Officially, nothing was ever found beneath Whitehall, but some files remained. Declassified decades later, they reveal testimonies from workers who claimed they heard sounds before the chamber collapsed. Faint knocking, rhythmic like heartbeat against stone, and one man, a night watchman, swore that before the final wall came down, he saw a figure standing in the dust, tall, broad, dressed in garments centuries out of time. He said the figure turned toward him and whispered one word before vanishing: "Brother." Skeptics dismissed it as wartime hysteria. But for those who study the Tudors, the story refuses to die. Even now in modern London, beneath the government buildings that stand where Whitehall once rose, construction workers report strange drafts, flickering lights, and the smell of candle wax where no candles burn. A few have even claimed to hear footsteps echoing from beneath the ground, slow, deliberate, uneven, like the limp of a man dragging a wounded leg. Historians debate endlessly what Henry's nightmare truly was. Some say it was his guilt, the spiritual decay of a king who believed himself God's chosen but acted as the devil's hand. Others believe it was literal, that in his torment he attempted to hide the evidence of a terrible act. Yet there is another theory, one whispered by those who have studied his later writings closely. They point to a marginal note found in one of Henry's personal prayer books, scrawled in his unmistakable hand. "Lord, let me not see him again. Let the stone hold him." If this note truly referred to his brother, then perhaps Henry did more than confess his sin. Perhaps he tried to imprison it. And perhaps that's why the chamber was sealed so carefully, with words of binding and symbols carved by hand. A desperate man's attempt to contain the past, to wall up the thing he could not face. Whatever was in that vault, it changed him. From the radiant prince who once rode through tournaments like the sun incarnate, to the bloated tyrant who sent wives and friends to their deaths with a flick of his pen, the transformation was not just of body but of soul, the slow corruption of a man who tried to bury his guilt beneath stone and prayer. But guilt does not rot like flesh. It waits. In 2017, an underground camera survey of the Whitehall area picked up an unexplained cavity beneath the modern Treasury building. Circular, perfectly formed, and unrecorded on any map. The government called it an anomaly. No excavation was allowed. Still, the whispers began again. Workers who pass through the lower corridors late at night say the air turns cold, even in summer. They say they hear faint knocking from below. Some claim to smell old smoke and hear the echo of a man's voice, murmuring Latin words no one understands. Frater ignotia mihi. Brother, forgive me. Perhaps it is nothing more than superstition, a legend born of history's shadows. Or perhaps it is the echo of a king's greatest sin, still pulsing beneath the heart of England, refusing to be silenced. For centuries, England has remembered Henry VIII as the monarch who defied Rome, who built and broke his wives, who reshaped a nation in his image. But maybe that was only the mask, the armor worn by a man haunted by the one thing he could never undo. And perhaps, in the stillness of certain nights, when the Thames fog rolls thick and the city quiets, if one stands near the old foundations of Whitehall and listens closely enough, one might still hear it. A heartbeat, a whisper, and the sound of a king begging forgiveness from the brother he sent to his grave.